like we are living beyond our means, honestly, and it's really
Yeah.
fun because for like a lot of the campaigns that were happening before the election that we had, a lot of it was we need to live within our means. We need to make sure we find ways of making sure the lowest class in society is catered for. But
Yeah.
still, in the same like regime, you're seeing like offices that don't make sense, like paying for someone's wife who's someone's wife, and their finances are being catered for by taxpayers, or you have some confidential expenditure that the citizens aren't sure what that confidential expenditure is.
Welcome back to the discussion. This has been a conversation around Kenya's ongoing protests within this week. In the first part, we discussed the protests, the happenings around the protests, looked at the reasons, and delved a little bit deeper into the nuances of the protest. In this second part, we'll go a little bit more, take a step back to why the finance bill was introduced to begin with, which is mainly about Kenya's debt situation, and we'll try and analyze the status of Kenya's debt and what we need to do around revenue mobilization in Kenya. And I say we because I also see the similar problem across several African countries. Ghana in particular have been on the edge of these issues in massive recent times. And so some of these issues are not exclusive to Kenya. And I think what's happening in Kenya, a lot of people can draw similarities to a lot of other African countries as well. And this conversation has been with three insightful people: Michelle Adika, who is a senior editor of the Strathmore Law Review, Paul Kituyi, who is also a law student and a debate enthusiast, and then Felix Nyachio, who is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya. Just to give a bit of backdrop to it, Kenya's debt currently, it's around 80 billion US dollars, both in terms of domestic and foreign debt, which is about 3/4 of Kenya's entire economic output every year going into debt servicing and debt payment. Now you have the current debt to GDP ratio of almost 70%, because around 67.5%, and 27 to 35% of annual revenue generations every year goes to just servicing the interest of Kenya's debt, not the principal, not the debt itself, just interest payments on the debt. Now, I found out an interesting statistic because researching on this, I wanted to find out from 2000 to 2024, what has been the percentage increase in Kenya's debt and what has been the percentage increase in Kenya's revenue mobilization. And there is 1,509% increase in Kenya's debt since 2000 and 2024. And there is just 103.4% debt in revenue since 2000 to 2024. Which is more of over 1,400 percentage debt increase that is not compensated for by revenue increase, which probably sums up why Kenya is in the current state that it is now. I'll start with this conversation, which is what has contributed to Kenya's staggering debt levels as we see it now, because the debt levels is what literally went into the desperation of going as low as wanting to tax people who are previously tax exempt due to how low their income were. And so what do you think brought Kenya to this level?
Thank you, Andrews, for the question. Kenya's debt didn't start today.
Yeah.
In the wake of early 2000, we started taking a vast majority of loans, and as such, this was meant to boost infrastructure projects, which were roads, railways, massive dams to have production of electricity, as well as also rural electrification, which has been ongoing for the longest time till the last term of the former president, Uhuru Kenyatta. That was in 2022. Yeah. We were still doing rural electrification. So over time, from the early 2000s till date, we didn't have the financial muscle, or we didn't have a financial footing to do all this infrastructure and still have development and growth in the country.
Yeah.
So we needed to get the money, and that is how we found ourselves into this rather precarious position where we are left with a huge chunk of debt, wondering how do we pay it back? Do we increase, of course, do we increase our tax policies so that we can get ourselves out of this debt? As you've clearly put it, we've had a majority percentage, let's say, as per every 100 shilling tax, about 60 shillings goes into paying our debt. So we're left with about 30 to 39 shillings, 39 to 40 shillings per every 100 shilling that we spend. And it is very sad that we are in this position. However, I would go with the words of Pope Francis, as he earlier said in the year, that we should have remorse for those countries that have debt so that we can actually give them an opportunity to have growth and development, and rather not crush such dreams and leaving them vulnerable and in a very state of poverty, so to say.
But is this not highly irresponsible? And maybe after this, you can chip in, Michelle. This is not highly irresponsible because even on an individual level, when we look at individuals taking on debt, we always say it's stupid to take on debt to the point that you cannot repay, more like living beyond your means. And we always say that you should live within your means, even as an individual. And imagine a country of countless people coming together to select what we would probably term as the most elite in terms of critical thinking, decision-making, probably the best crop that we could find to say, come represent our country. And then over decades, have different sets of people making the exact same mistake of borrowing and borrowing. And the much more painful one is usually you have people ending up borrowing to pay debts, right? And so even just this year alone, in January, Kenya got $1 million, $1 billion actually from the IMF, or I think it's around 1 billion or 2.3 billion from the IMF. And then just this month, as part of the negotiations that you mentioned, for which reason the finance bill came in, there was also a negotiation to get another $1.1 billion from the IMF. And the question is, like, obviously, debt probably is needed at some point. Every country in the world has some amount of debt. It's needed at some point to fund certain infrastructure projects or development projects that you need. But I don't think Kenya's problem is probably needing debt to develop. It's whether or not there's been logic and responsibility applied to the way in which debt has been used in the country's development history in the past. And I don't know your thoughts on this, Michelle.
I think the problem is something that you've already talked about. Like, we are living beyond our means, honestly. And it's really fun because for like a lot of the campaigns that were happening before the election that we had, a lot of it was we need to live within our means. We need to make sure we find ways of making sure the lowest class in society is catered for. But still, in the same regime, you're seeing like offices that don't make sense, like paying for someone's wife who's someone's wife, and their finances are being catered for by taxpayers, or you have some confidential expenditure that the citizens aren't sure what that confidential expenditure is. Money going renovating people's houses when there's people that there's a housing crisis, there's people that live in deplorable conditions, and all of this is still happening. So we are definitely living beyond our means, and borrowing wouldn't be a problem if that money was going into something that's bringing money back, but it's not. It's furnishing people's luxurious lifestyles, and we just can't afford to do that as a country anymore. So we are taking so much money and nothing is coming out of it, or at least the citizens aren't seeing anything coming out of it. I think the problem is and I think the president had talked about this in his speech when he was really commending himself for sending Kenyans out to places like Saudi Arabia and UAE for jobs and all of that, and that's something great that he's done for our country. But that's clearly recognizing that there's an employment crisis within, and we need people working within to even the money to be able to pay this debt or even not require this debt at the end of the day. But we are allowing people to leave and go build other economies, which is just extremely problematic. So I think like all of that is like slowly leading to the debt crisis. I think also the state has increasingly started taking out a lot more money. Because like our president, I think, has taken out more than our previous president, the former president Uhuru Kenyatta, took out in his 10 years. He's taken about 3/4 out of debt, in comparison. So I think it's a bit problematic that it's increasingly becoming something we are getting used to and something that needs to be done about it.
I know that one of the most basic logics around debt specifically is to, even right from corporate financing through individuals to state level, is to make sure that you are taking on debt that you invest or you put to something that can generate revenue in the long term to pay back its debt. So there's always a saying that a debt that cannot pay for itself is a bad debt that shouldn't be approached. And I want to know, Paul, what are your thoughts on what the government have taken debts to do? And has it always been far away from literally taking debts that could pay for themselves? Because some of the things that Michelle is mentioning, these are not things that are generating revenue in any form of any sort. And debt, especially with compound interest, very, very expensive, very, very quickly, with factors such as currency depreciation, currency exchange, can really make debts very, very expensive in a very short time. So what do you think has been the problem in terms of the utilization of monies that have come from borrowing, and whether or not they've been very, very poor or have not been used for things that could pay for themselves?
All right. Thank you. And I think this is a really important question. It's the biggest thing that has been plaguing us. Recurrent expenditure. Like, the problem we've had for the past 20 years is borrowing less to service recurrent expenditure. And it has become completely problematic and it's bad. And the biggest form or the biggest way in the way this recurrent expenditure manifests is through salary. I did a deep dive of these in my status yesterday. Some opinions are more controversial than others, but the idea that I was aiming for was a lot of what we use, like in Kenya, let me put it this way. I know it's true that some people want to get rich through politics, but it's especially true in Kenya. Like, if you want to get rich, win a political seat, I think you're sorted for life. It's why so many people want to delve into politics. Immediately someone is 21 years old, they want to run for member of county assembly, they just solicit funds, they'll borrow debts from their friends and that kind of thing. So that's the paradigm, and that's the way we exist, right? But then that becomes problematic because the number or the amount of money that we spend on salaries is extremely, it's a lot. So the draft, there are many drafts of our constitution. The new constitution that we keep talking about, I still talked about this yesterday. There was an initial draft that was only supposed to accommodate a third of the employees that we have today on the public payroll. But because politics was booming in the 2000s, they said, no, we have to accommodate each and every single person. So like they went and they did a redraft and that kind of thing. They constitutionally done in a place called Boma, so there are like a few versions of the Boma draft. Many of them had like the servants that we have right now. So that's the first way. And these employees are paid a lot. So these MPs fly first class all the time, they travel regularly. They get so much for airtime allowance, entertainment allowance. Many of them have convoys of cars. It's like a lot. And like their salaries, the sitting allowances are so many. I think there are things that they do. So it becomes really bad. And the worst part is many of them are arrogant and they flaunt it in front of the people. There's another MP, I won't name the name here, but I think the ones that know her. So she, like, actively, she's a nominated senator. She just flaunts in front of the people and says, your tax money is paying me. What are you going to do about it? I'm taking the taxes, there's nothing you're going to do. This is when she gets into Twitter, brawls with people on Twitter. I think Nyabuto knows her, but so he knows what I'm talking about. So you have this continued level of arrogance, and people are tired of it. So recurrent expenditure is the big thing. The second thing is just stolen money. I think like when a Eurobond is borrowed, the Eurobond was borrowed in 2014. It's what I think we finished paying the other day, but it's like taken a toll from us. So Eurobond money was taken and it was stolen. It went into people's pockets. So this was money that Kenyan taxpayers still had to pay, but there was no account for well over 60% of that money, right?
Yeah.
So it was really, really problematic. The other thing is like various infrastructure projects that are ventured into. At best, when you have this money borrowed, it goes into infrastructure. And infrastructure is good. You can make an argument for it as a catalyst to good development. But most of the time, people would rather see that money go into manufacturing that can then enable infrastructure to be built. But most of it has gone to infrastructure. And many of the guys that build these roads in Kenya, like from China. So like the Chinese people come and build this infrastructure anyway. So it's like Kenyan people are not taking the jobs anyway. They're just going to find a road that has been built and like it's good, but like it hasn't benefited Kenyans in so many ways. So I think this is the problem, or like the biggest manifestation on how debt is, misused and that kind of thing. So it's largely disutilized.
Yeah, that's very, very fascinating as well. And I think that goes a lot into why the debt levels are the way in which they are. And I'll give you a backdrop to the question I'm about to ask you, Felix. In 2014, Paul rightly mentioned you had a 2 billion euro bond loans. Let me jump a bit. In 2018, you had 2.5 billion euro bond, and you took that to repay debts in Kenya. In 2019, you had 1.5 billion US dollars from the IMF. In 2020, you had 739 million from the IMF. In 2021, you had 1 billion from Eurobond loans again. In 2022, you had 750 million from World Bank. January 2024, you had 2.3 million from IMF. And in June 2024, there's a negotiation for 1.1 billion from the IMF. And the question I'm asking is, obviously, creditors on the international market, knowing the persistent rate of, like every creditor rationally, knowing the persistent rate of borrowing and knowing the terrible repayment track record, should be able to say, I'm stopping at this point and it's becoming incessant and you are not able to pay. Because like, just think about the relations between maybe a friend of yours and you. The friend comes to borrow from you every single time, is unable to pay back, and the amounts just keep increasing. At some point, you clearly say no, and it happens with corporate banks and corporate institutions. Why has it been so difficult for international monetary organizations, international creditors such as the World Bank, the IMF, Eurobond, to be able to say, no, we are not lending you money because clearly you don't have the capacity to pay back?
Thank you, Andrews. In hindsight, I'd say maybe we have good chance when we go to borrow this money. That's why they keep on giving us. But jokes aside, it's really wanting. And actually, at the end of 2022, just to add on what you've said, we had borrowed $6.7 billion from China, $6.7 billion from China. We had $7.1 billion to bondholders that are there. We have $3.8 billion from the industrialized countries. We have $3.5 billion from the African Development Bank, which played a key role in the infrastructure of the Nairobi Expressway, same to the Standard Gauge Railway. We have another $1.9 billion from international commercial banks. And the number keeps increasing and increasing and increasing. And you get to ask yourself, to what point will we keep borrowing? And to what point will we be sustainable to actually pay off this debt and still have growth and development in our country so that we cannot rob our future generations at least a decent life? It's really damaging to the economy, since we end up paying more in interest, and our governance arm of government fails us from time to time when it comes to the issue of how this money is spent. Yes, we are borrowing from the World Bank, IMF, and international commercial banks, etc. Our primary role, or our primary reason for borrowing this debt is for infrastructural development, or for maybe settling out previous debts. As you said, we keep borrowing so that we can also offset some other debts and having a payment plan for them. I was referencing to the article by Lewis Miller for the African Library, as well as also a commentary made by our Office of the Director of Public Prosecution, where they were estimating Kenya's budget, 30% goes to corruption. And corruption is majorly led by people who are in governance positions. There's no way I, as a citizen, can get hold of this money. It's those members who are in the governance role. And the wastefulness that we see coming out from there is what leads us further and further into debt, just like Paul had said. And it's really damaging for us as a country and as a nation. I do not see a way out for us, but hopefully maybe we stop borrowing and we start thinking of living within our means. As Michelle said, that's the only way we can stop going to international lenders for this one.
Yeah, a quick follow-up though. Who would you blame for this one? Do you think it's the country who's going to borrow's fault, or do you think it's creditors who just keep on granting the blank checks?
I blame us as a country going to borrow. We're already stretched. We are at our elastic limit, but we still have the notion we will pay it. So let's keep borrowing. Let's keep going out there. It is we lack discipline as a country. That's what I can say. We have bad manners, as Professor P.L.O. Lumumba will say. Kenyans have bad manners, so we have bad manners when it comes to borrowing.
Yeah, Michelle, there are two possible problems with revenue, or like with the reasons why the revenue mobilized by the country is never enough. One could be that revenue mobilization itself is poor and it's not efficient. Another could be that expenditure is not prioritized and there's a lot of wasteful spending. And also like corruption can be a reason, but obviously corruption is more or less like a canker within the system. The question I'm asking is, which of these two is the problem? For which reason Kenya doesn't seem to have enough funding and would almost always have to resort to borrowing? Because the borrowing levels is almost year in, year out on multiple fronts of multiple lenders. And it's very, very clear that revenue is not enough. Do you think it's more revenue mobilization problems or expenditure problems?
I think it's both. I think the expenditure issues have already been highlighted in that a lot of money, because we've already previously taken a lot of debt, so a lot of money that's taken again is used to repay that debt. But there's also different like loopholes that are being created for money to go to different like areas that aren't necessarily need, especially for a country that's economically, at least in terms of like revenue and how much the government gets on its needs. So I think that's a problem. I also think because a lot of people haven't been able to find formal like ways of employment, because the government, has constantly, every time, we are going to the polls, they always say, we're going to create jobs, the youth are going to get jobs. The president the other day was saying, hundreds of people have been employed, but we don't know where or what they're doing. So a lot of people then move to the informal sector or move to, doing like maybe some small online gigs and stuff like that. Things that are difficult when it comes to like carry, trying to tax you and all of that. So that makes it difficult also for the state when that's like a vast majority of the population and we can't like tax these people or we can't like acquire that revenue. But again, that's like a problem the state created by not creating like formal places where these individuals could get employed. So I think it's a bit of both. Like there's problems in terms of like the ability to like collect revenue, but also where the money we are getting is going is a bit wanting.
Paul, you in your previous submission, and thank you very much, Michelle, for that as well. You in your previous submission, Paul, highlighted the expenditure problems, right? And clearly from what Michelle is saying, there's also a revenue mobilization sort of issue around there. What do you think are the underlying factors of this revenue mobilization issue? And then I'll go to Felix about maybe how we can try and fix these revenue mobilization issues. But first to you, Paul.
Okay, so admittedly, there are a lot of people that are outside the taxes that could be taxed. I think a lot of people do businesses and like they walk away scot-free with taxes. So like remember the whole idea was don't tax us. It's not that don't tax us, that tax us, but like have a very, very clear account of our money. But because like there are a lot of people who escape taxes, and I think genuinely the tax risk will be broader than it is, because very few people are paying the tax burden. And like big corporations, especially now away from like the lower classes, there are a lot of tax evaders, and many of them are the president's friends and that kind of thing. And they ride on that sympathy vote, and they end up being elected governors and senators, but they evaded tax. Now when they are there, they can now evade tax even more. So I think it's then an accountability problem from like the top. I think there's been the famous story of Kituyi Brewery. They have been known to not pay taxes for a long time. But the lady was condemned by the public and then spun into a sympathy vote when like she won the Senator of Nakuru. And everyone knows she hasn't paid taxes. And apparently now she's one of the better performing senators in Kenya. So even if that's true, the like to hide to our people, but like she's still not paid taxes, and that will go a long way. I think also the idea of more manufacturing is imperative, because I think we are largely service-based as a country, but I think more manufacturing will also like help a greater deal. There were attempts by I think the previous president to do that. So I honestly think, in my opinion, a lot of what Ruto is doing right now in terms of exporting jobs and people working out and then having to pay remittances, it's like taking the long route into what could be a more direct way of generating taxes here. So I think more productivity and like that will go a long way.
Nyabuto, how do we deal with this? Because it seems to be like a problem, like a generational problem, probably one of the most difficult problems in terms of world governance to try and resolve. How do you resolve this issue of having an unsustainable debt level plagued with insufficient revenue mobilization scheme, coupled with ridiculous, wasteful expenditure? What is the solution to this confusing web?
Thank you, Andres. I'd say the reason why we are where we are is because of bad governance or poor governance, for lack of a better word. And that summarizes it in its entirety. If we can be able to shape our governance, because it plays a significant role in promoting the tax revenues, I think we'll go a step further. Proper governance, in my opinion, entails ensuring that there's transparency and accountability that will promote better tax measures. If this is not realized, we end up losing more, and people tend to evade taxes, as my good learned friend Paul has indicated. We even have a senator who's currently sitting in parliament, yet we know her company had evaded taxes for the longest, and she had a case against with the Kenya Revenue Authorities. And that is just to name one of the very many individuals out there. If we can be able to shape this and help citizens and businesses actually realize the importance of paying their taxes and how their taxes are being used through accountability measures, then we are a step forward. We are going to be a step forward. The issues of tax revenue, and this is where also the international donors and civil societies come to book. In your earlier question to me, if these countries that we borrow from put a hard stance on us, just recently, as at the close of 2022, we've seen countries as China pulling back from lending us further, or when it comes to the loans. We've seen commercial banks in Japan, Italy, France, and Germany, Britain, refusing or pulling back, as well as China, in giving us money or lending us money, rather, that we've borrowed because of our trimmed exposure to risk of default. The best way we can do this is through accountability measures and proper governance. If we can realize these two key goals, then I think our tax revenue measure will be along the path of bettering our debt paying back and also improving our GDP, so to say.
Okay. Back to you, Paul, and then I'll give Michelle the last say on this one. What do you think we should do? What do you think the Kenyan government should do? Because obviously, it seems to be in a place between a rock and a hard place. Like, obviously, they need to raise revenue because the pressure from the IMF is not going to go away. They need the money from the IMF program as well. They tried raising that revenue through the finance bill and they got massive backlash. And obviously, a lot of government resort to trying to raise taxes or increase taxes to get revenue. And so the issue then is, it seems to be an ineffective solution. What other solutions should government try to explore, at least in the way to try and resolve this problem?
Okay, now this is me speaking, like, not really devil's advocate, but trying to see it from Nyabuto's perspective. I think he tried to do a lot too fast because he was too ambitious. So you can still hike taxes, just don't hike them. But veracity? Like the veracity in terms of how it was like affecting people was like too high. So there are things you can hike taxes on. Like generally, there are people who make a lot of money and can tax. Focus all those time and resources on reaching those people. I think the other thing is there are very reasonable taxes in some of the bills. I think there was a tax on 35% of income made above 500,000 shillings, which like in the top 1% in Kenya, actually 0.5% in Kenya. I don't think those people would like be hesitant to pay taxes and that kind of thing. Now, acknowledging you would collect as much revenue as you would have had this thing gone through, one, it's still some revenue. And secondly, you have to make a concession that it's part of a bigger problem that informs this, other than collecting revenue. In my personal opinion, public expenditure. And I've said this again, and I've said it if you have, you've seen my status go in. The biggest problem we have in Kenya is the amount of public servants on the payroll. And those public servants are very wasteful. And like the money that's given to them to use for their daily expenditure is too bad. Like they get rich very quickly. There's one of the president's closest allies, his name is Oscar Sudi. So this guy, his political reputation is that he never even made it to high school. He dropped out at grade 6 and that kind of thing. But he'll go to a church and give in a fundraiser 20 million shillings and walk away. He's been doing this every time. And like serious account for that money is probably lucky. So these are some of the things that really prompt people to ask, where is this money from? So solution to this, there needs to be a broader conversation, maybe even a referendum and a consensus that we need to scrap off many of our expenses. We have an expenditure problem in terms of this public servants. Like they are the council that in this country. And many of them are arrogant. Many of them did not respond to the citizens when the citizens were going to their houses in their constituencies asking, can you listen to us? This is why they burnt down their houses in their cars. A very valid frustration. So it won't be easy because nobody wants to lose their livelihood. But I think it's something that has to happen. We want like long-term solution.
Yeah. Thanks for that submission as well. Michelle, to you to have the last say on this. What should governments do to try and resolve the issues of revenue, expenditure, debt, wastefulness, corruption, the issues that we basically highlighted here?
I agree with both Felix and Paul, especially in regards to the cuts. There's a lot of positions that just need to be cut out, especially for now. Like if they'll be relevant in the future, then maybe we can think about that. But I think for now, the government needs to channel funds towards more pressing issues like, healthcare, food, housing, and all of that. I also think we definitely need a bit more transparency because I think with everything that's been happening, the international community has been assuming that Kenyans hate paying taxes and we don't want to allow the government to collect revenue, which isn't the case. I don't think Kenyans hate paying taxes. I think the problem is we just have no idea where that money goes a lot of the time, and we're just afraid is going, into people's pockets and just making other people ultra rich as other people in the country suffer. So I think a bit more transparency would just make it easier for people to understand maybe why certain taxes are going up, like, understanding where the money is going, removing things like confidential budgets, telling us what infrastructural projects you're working on. Because I think the other day, in our president's speech, I'd say like maybe he was just trying to like gaslight us or something, because he was trying to talk about all the things the bill could have done and all the things it could have done. But it was so abstract. Like, you're taking so much money from us, but we don't really know tangibly where that money is going. So I think a bit more transparency would even make it easier for Kenyans to see, okay, I'm paying a lot of taxes today, but I'm going to benefit from it tomorrow, or the future generations are going to see like a better Kenya. So I think transparency and obviously just cutting out all the unnecessary expenditure might help the country. Yeah.
I think this is also the perfect launch to the third part of the conversation we would be having soon. This has been the conversation where we are discussing happenings in Kenya. In the first part, we had a detailed discussion about the protest itself and its nuances. In this second part, we've taken a step back to really analyze Kenya's debt situation, probably analyzing it from more of a decade's perspective as to what has led to the indebtedness that we see and the high debt-to-GDP ratio. It's been a conversation with Michelle Adika, Paul Kituyi, and Nyabuto Nyachio. Thanks for staying with us on this second part. We'll be back with the third part when we talk about Kenya's democracy, the status of trust in that democracy, and how to try and salvage the situation of mistrust that exists there. Stay with us. We'll be right back.